and former press secretary to House Speaker John Boehner, whom I'm reminded, Brendan, had that infamous quote when he said, trying to manage and organize this Republican Party is like herding cats. I'm sure you remember that one. It seems like things haven't changed that much. But I'll start with Amisha here. Once again, we were on the verge of a shutdown, this time right before Christmas. Only once again, we have a continuing resolution going until March. What is your sense of public reaction to the ongoing spectacle driven by Republicans to this piecemeal style of governing? Will we be on the brink again in March?
Well, first and foremost, there's a lot of questions. I think we will definitely be back on the brink again in March. I think that the general American public is quite frankly just upset over the back and forth of this. We've come to the edge of a government shutdown multiple times at this point. I think that they're used to the countdown clocks that are run on cable news networks when it comes to government shutdowns. But the thing that brought most people to the polls this past election cycle was the economy. And if you're talking about Republicans who stood on the economy, said that they could make it better, we're supposed to be protecting the working class, and you see them pushing against some of the very necessities of that class of individuals, whether we're talking about not ensuring that federal workers get their checks, whether we're talking about, possible delays in FAA services and things like that, because that is also government run. When you're talking about the issues related to people who are on SSI, Social Security, income and disability, all of these things fall under the purview of the federal government. And I think that for everyday individuals, everyday Americans who rely on things like SNAP food stamp benefits, there was a lot of fear and quaking as to what could occur. And at this point, it is who are the Republicans, who is Donald Trump actually aligning himself with? Because it seemed as though at the very last minute, Elon Musk basically pulled the rug from under the Republican Party, who had already in good faith made negotiations to ensure that that continuing resolution got across the aisle. And at the end of the day, they decided to basically go against it at the behest of a billionaire, the richest man in the world. And I think that at this point, a lot of Americans are saying, hey, who actually is going to be running this nation? Is it going to be Donald Trump, who did campaign and won a large percentage of the votes? Or is it going to be Elon Musk, who at the end of the day is non-elected, but also does not care about the sacrifices of everyday American people and was willing to shut down the government, force a government shutdown, and obviously cannot count because the votes were just never there to get what he wanted passed anyway.
And Brendan, I'm curious what you make of all this drama over the debt ceiling specifically, because the bills passed yesterday didn't even touch it. Was it all Trump stirring the pot? And what does it say that he made this wild call to raise the debt ceiling, which doesn't line up with Republican positions for the last decade plus, and then throw this process into 11th hour chaos and then not even get what he wanted?
Well, Donald Trump clearly woke up to the realities of the legislative landscape that he's going to be facing when he becomes president. You have to raise the debt ceiling. That's going to have to happen at some point. The current debt ceiling, I think, is going to be hit in January. There's usually a few things that they can do. And so sometime by summer, it's going to have to take place. That's always really hard. And especially when Republicans are in charge, we have a lot of members who just simply won't ever vote to raise the debt ceiling. It's just a bad vote. And so Trump's team, I think, realized we don't want to have that problem on our watch. Let's take care of it now. Let's raise the debt ceiling now. And this way I can focus on my agenda. Of course, that didn't happen because, again, there are enough Republicans who won't want to do that. The problem is when he's in charge, that same dynamic is going to exist. And Republicans have made themselves a lot of promises in the last couple of days that I think are going to be very difficult to keep. They're talking about $2.5 trillion in spending cuts that they're going to want to do. I'm curious what they're looking at, where they're going to find that, because they've already ruled out touching most of the big spending programs. So I think that they've set themselves up for failure next year, and it's too bad because it could really get in the way of the things that they want to do.
Amisha, was Trump somewhat delusional trying to assign blame to Biden and Democrats for this chaos, saying if there's a shutdown, let it be on Biden's watch? I mean, how far would that even get him if he's prompting the chaos?
Well, he was absolutely delusional, but I think that his calculus was if it happens before Donald Trump takes office, the American public generally, regardless of when a shutdown occurs, does not necessarily look at Congress as the person to blame. They always have looked at the person who is sitting at the seat of power in the White House. So he's not necessarily off in that ideology. But I do think that he was off in how he went about that approach, because what we saw was we saw on X multiple pieces of commentary from Elon Musk himself, who was pushing towards the shutdown, who was arguing things that weren't even available in the continuing resolution to begin with, who was quite frankly just lying about it. And I think that the American people caught on. And there was a frustration with this happening, or potentially happening, so close to the holiday season, so close to Christmas. And for all of the back and forth that the media gave, wondering why President Biden wasn't speaking out on it, what commentary did he have? He didn't really have to speak out on it, because you had Donald Trump over here as president-elect shouting up and down the streets on Truth Social. You had Elon Musk on X tweeting up a storm. They're the two people who negotiated this outside of Congress were the individuals who were willing to blow up the government for Donald Trump in his own mind to come back and save it, get rid of the debt ceiling. He's the person who ran up the national debt to the tune of $7.6 trillion during his first term. This is a guy who has never once found a bill that he was willing to pay. And this is a guy who is willing to not have an American budget, but continue to take out massive amounts of debt. But he does not want the blame on him. He wants to come in as Superman and be a savior for chaos that he created.
And Brendan, you served a couple of Republican House speakers, and you know the players in the game. But when Mike Johnson afterwards said he talked to Trump before the vote, I guess to get the okay, but also talked to Elon Musk, how bad of a look is that for Republicans? And how do you think GOP folks on the Hill perceive that? I heard a Trump supporter grumble they didn't recall voting for Elon Musk in November.
Yeah, it's going to be a huge problem for governing. Look, when I was working for Speaker Ryan, Donald Trump was president, we were always one tweet away from Trump screwing something up or blowing up a plan that we had. Now, at that point, though, Donald Trump had staff around him. There were systems in place. We could get in touch with him and sort of straighten things out. Elon Musk is just some guy out there floating around saying things. And as Amisha said, a lot of things he was saying about the bill weren't true. They were mischaracterizing what's in there. If that is hanging over you at any time, and somebody who's not actually involved in the process, really difficult to then have any type of order in the House. People trying to line up votes for things, and all of a sudden this guy who saw something on the internet and saw something on Twitter and is blowing it up. But of course, Republicans have made this problem for themselves. They have empowered him. Donald Trump empowered him. The only thing that I think maybe any sense of optimism you can have for Republicans is I don't know how long Donald Trump is going to tolerate the idea that Elon Musk is actually in charge here. It's very clear that Donald Trump sort of ran to the front of the parade after Musk blew this thing up. And if the narrative takes hold that Donald Trump is the second most powerful person in government, I assume he's going to try to take him down to the knees at some point soon.
Okay. Brendan and Amisha, always a good chat with the both of you. Thank you so much.